Verse 9 is the fifth one. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed, as they had been completed. The prayers of the martyrs. In the same way, we can understand that how God could be using conquest and war and famine and even death as he slams the Roman Empire. But here he brings a fifth force that is working to unseat the Romans. Who are these martyrs that are praying? Well, it could literally be the martyrs, and I guess there's no problem with that. But most likely, remember, this is a book of symbols. Most likely, it's the martyrs refer to all those who are suffering under Roman persecution, not just the ones who have died. They cry out to God, "How long? How long?" And their cry doesn't go unheard. It means something to God. This is the point the Revelator wants to bring to us. We know how conquerors and battles, famines and death war against a nation and weigh against a nation. We see that. But in the same way, the prayers of those who are being persecuted has a power that war and famine and death can't touch. Because the suffering cry out to God, and He is the source of power and rule. The one who ultimately wields the sword and the civil rule of the earth. He answers. And that's what verse 12 through 17 is about. God answers the prayers of the martyrs. I watched as he opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as late figs drop from a tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll, rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in caves among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" That's God answering those prayers. Now some look at the great day of God's wrath and they jump to a final judgment scene and a destruction of the evil in the world. They read this and say that, look, this stuff has never happened. So it must be still to come. It must be at the end in the world. But in the midst of that, we forget. We lapse sometimes, and we forget that we're dealing with apocalyptic literature. And these images are symbolic and metaphorical. And so we have to ask, what do these images represent? What did this kind of image mean to the people who listened to it? And here we have some help. I'd encourage you to turn back to Isaiah chapter 13, 9 through 13, as he describes very similar images. And over in verse 34, verses 1 through 5, and 9 and 10, and some others, he reveals some very similar type images. He said in chapter 34, he says that's the judgment upon Edom. Chapter 13, it's the judgment on Babylon at the hands of the Medes. Now, did those things literally happen? Is this was that a physical description of what happened to the Babylonians, what happened to the Edomites? No. Once again, this is apocalyptic writing. These are just images of God's judgment. We talk about the world being turned over, the mountains shaking. These are those kind of images. So, the sixth seal reveals God's hand. This is God's judgment. It's a physical description of what's going to happen spiritually. This is God bringing His wrath against Rome. And all the rest is small compared to this. Now, this ought to terrify. This ought to terrify anybody to think that God's hand is against them. And it's meant to be a terrible image to show you the God's power. And so that you will not just know that God is bringing judgment upon Rome, but you'll feel some of it. So, we see the terrible thought of warfare and famine and death. But then the greater fear of God's judgment. Who could stand? Who could possibly stand against something like that? That's the question that was asked, and the question then that is answered in chapter 7. As the seventh seal is about to be unfurled, God says, wait. Verse 3, chapter 7. Don't harm anything. Stand back until I put my seal on my people. And then God moves down and seals 144,000 people. And that's been the speculation of all kinds of imagination things. What does it mean that God seals 144,000? Does that mean that's the number of people that were aligned with God who lived in Asia Minor? In apocalyptic literature, once again, virtually everything is symbolic and has image, and the images mean something beyond just their physical appearance. That includes the numbers as well. And here we are introduced to a couple of new number symbols that would have been common through Jewish thought. When you think of the number 12, thinking biblically, what do you think of? 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. Doesn't take long to figure out that 12 is a number that in the day represented God's people. 12 referred to God's people, and so 144 is 12 times 12, God's people, emphasizing large number of God's people. And when you hear that number 1,000, what do you think of? God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. That means He owns all of them. And so we have this number, 12 times 12 times 1,000. It's a numerical way of saying every single one of God's people. Nobody is going to be left out. None are going to have to go through this alone. Everybody who is aligned with God can know God is walking with them through this. God is watching over every single one of His people. That's what it means when He says He seals 144,000. And what is the seal? Well, once again, look back to our cheat sheet, the Old Testament. Ezekiel chapter 9, the prophet prophesies about Babylon coming 586 BC to carry off God's people into exile. However, God says He is putting a seal on His people. Now, when they carried them off to Babylon, did they walk off with numbers on their foreheads or Social Security numbers or some other ID? Was the seal literal? No, it never was a literal thing. It's just a way of saying He is taking note of each one of them. He is putting a seal. When you'd send a package in their day, one of the things you would do to make sure that it got there was you would put a seal on it that represented who you were. That meant that package belonged to you. God's saying He's putting a seal on His people. This persecution's coming. They're getting ready to go into it. And the judgment is coming. They're going to have to go through that too. But they will not go through it alone. God is putting a seal on each one of them. And then, the results. To what end? What is this seventh seal and the wrath that is coming? What is going to become of all of that? To what end is the seal on God's people going to mean anything? chapter 7, verse 9, it says, after this, after the sealing, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Verse 13, then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they, and where did they come from? Well, that's our question, right? I answered, sir, you know. And he said, these are those who have came out of the great tribulation. They have washed the robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. See, these are the same group. These are the 144,000. We saw them, God putting His mark on them as they go into tribulation. Here He says, here's what they're going to look like when they come out of the tribulation. After all is said and done, who can stand? Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night. In His temple He who sits on the throne will spread His tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. And once again, I would point you back to Isaiah. Just like you had apocalyptic curses, you also have apocalyptic blessings. They are renewed to joy and life. You know, people read that part and they say, oh, look, that must be talking about heaven. No tears and all that. But read Isaiah 25 and 6 through 8 about what it's going to be like after they come out of Babylon. This is a mosaic of images of deliverance and blessing. This is a very helpful passage. And it really helps us to understand in a nutshell what Revelation teaches us. Revelation is going to teach the same message over and over and over again. It's going to lead us through what God is about to do in this, as the Rome aligns itself against God's people. It's going to lead us through that. But it's going to keep rehearsing this message. One of the great concepts of Revelation. We've already, introduced a couple. God is at work in the world and on behalf of His people. And don't mistake the flexing of armies and the threats of death as the ultimate shows of great power. There is a greater power. The Lion of the tribe of Judah looks weak to the world, but he packs a surprise. In chapter 7, the curtain is pulled back on suffering and persecution. It doesn't make light of it, nor does it glibly promise that God is going to swoop down and deliver us from every trial that might beset us. The Christians in chapter 7, the Christians in Asia Minor, are going to go through the persecution, and even going to have to endure God's retribution on the Romans. And many are going to be killed. But the point is, that's not the end of the story. God will not forget them. He has marked them. He has His eye on them. And He will deliver them. Salvation, He promises, will come for every single one of God's people. No, not one of them will get thrown under the bus. And not one of them will be forgotten. All of them will see glory again. That's His promise. And in that regard, chapter 7 is the telling of the message of Revelation. And that message is going to get told over and over and over again. And we'll pick it up next time in chapter 8.